Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will be getting started in just a few minutes. We want to let everybody in first. People usually come in over the next few minutes. So we'll start soon, but so glad you're all here. Again, we're just waiting a few minutes while people continue to log in, and we let them into the room. Wherever you are in the world, I hope all is well for you. And I know we usually have folks from far and wide. Our speaker is himself in Berlin, where it is midnight. Still people coming in, so we'll wait just a couple more minutes. There's the group. Hello, everyone. Welcome. All right, I'm going to, as we're continuing to let folks in, I'm going to just go over a few things with you, including the history here of what narrative medicine rounds are. I am Craig Irvine, and I'll be your host this evening. On behalf of the Division of Narrative Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, I'd like to welcome those of you who are joining Narrative Rounds for the first time, and welcome back all the returning attendees. Narrative medicine arose at Columbia in 2001 and is now an international movement at the intersection of humanities, the arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice. Narrative training equips clinicians to humbly try to comprehend their patients' experiences and perspectives so as to deliver equitable and effective healthcare. Rigorous training and practice of narrative medicine helps all those interested in person-centered, respectful healthcare to deepen their self-awareness, clinical attunement, collaborative skills, and creative capacities. Our commitments to healthcare justice underlie our writing, teaching, research, advocacy, and delivery of care. The narrative medicine community assembles monthly at rounds to grow our knowledge, partnership, and commitment to a just and effective healthcare future. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I've been asked to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules. Many of you will be familiar with these already, to ensure the program goes smoothly. Please keep your microphone muted to cut down on background noise during the program. And be forewarned that if there are any disruptions or inappropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. During the talk, we ask people to keep chat interactions to a minimum As we get closer to the Q&A part of the event, I'll invite you to submit questions via the chat for our speaker. So hold on to those questions, please do ask them, but wait until invited to drop them into the chat. Before that, we won't be monitoring questions. The event is being recorded. Everyone who registered will get the link to it a day or two after the event, and you can share it as you wish. Captioning will be available during tonight's event. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jens Brockmeier, who received his degree in philosophy, psychology, and linguistics, literary theory from the Free University of Berlin, where at the age of 26, he took his first appointment as assistant professor of epistemology and philosophy of science. Since then, he has held teaching and research opportunities in Toronto, the New School in New York, Oxford, among others, before he joined the American University of Paris in 2014. His research is concerned with the cultural fabric of mind and language with a focus on narrative. His main interest is in the constructive and creative function of narrative for autobiographical memory, personal identity, and the understanding of time and temporality. He has explored these issues both empirically and philosophically. Empirically in various languages and sociocultural context as developmental phenomena and under conditions of health and illness, philosophically in terms of narrative hermeneutics. So some of his recent books include Narrative as a Form of Life, Beyond the Archive, Memory, Narrative, and the Autobiographical Process, Culture Narrative, Beyond Loss, Dimension, Memory, and Identity, and the paperback edition of Literacy, Narrative, and Culture. So that gives you an idea of the broad range of his interests and the depth of his studies. He's a scholar of philosophy, psychology, and linguistics and literary theory. And he will speak tonight on the question of the resiliency of the self in a talk titled, How Resilient is the Self? A Hermeneutic Look at an Unresolved Question. Just want to add a personal note that Dr. Brockmeier's work has been and is and continues to be a great inspiration for our students in the master's program. It's at the center of several courses, but most importantly, the core course that all students take in their first year on close reading. So Dr. Brockmeier, please welcome. It's a great honor to have you here.
Well, thank you very much, Craig, for this nice and very friendly introduction and presentation. It is, of course, a great pleasure and honor to be invited to the Columbia Narrative Medicine Round. And I would like to thank especially Rita Sharon, whom I see there, Craig and Kristen Manietta, and all the other people involved in the preparation and organization of this talk, to make it all possible. I should perhaps start by saying that my interest in the self, this is our topic today, is not really new, nor are my attempts to approach this question in the context of narrative medicine. And in preparing my round today, I found some notes for a talk I gave in this series on narrative medicine in 2004, pretty much 20 years ago. The talk then was based on a study of stories told by a woman with a neurotrauma who tried to make sense of her life vis-a-vis the sudden loss of a larger part of her autobiographical memories. One trope she used. Hello? Hello? Is everything okay? Good.
If you're a participant, please mute.
Okay. So one trope she used in talking about what she lost with her autobiographical memory was my own time, the time of myself, and the time of my own self. And well, there it was, the self, the magic S word. I suspect in these last 20 years in which an immense clinical and scholarly wealth of narrative medicine has been presented in this hall, first in analog and now in digital ways, the S word, the self word, has been one of the most used words at all. If you would put this in a scenario in terms of William James' stream of consciousness, you face a stream that has flowed through this hall, and if you reach your hand into this stream, you probably pull out a self word. Well, self is a word that is often combined with the article the, which is usually the first step to its substantialization. Its seeming transformation from a word into an entity. 20 years ago, I wasn't that aware of the problems that come with this substantialization. So let me ask today, what makes the S word, the self word, so attractive to be taken as representing a coherent, independent and substantial unit, as something that is like the core of a person or a fortress of an ego? What makes it so resilient that it seems to survive in nearly every environment? Of course, for a question that is that tricky, there are many multiple answers. There are multiple answers, and here comes one. It has been said that there is nothing in the universe except molecules and meanings. No doubt, as in the case study I mentioned, molecules and their interactions are substantially affected in neurotrauma. We can even localize where exactly in the brain what happened. But the picture is surely not complete, because what is missing is the meaning that this woman gave to this neuromolecular mega event that happened in her head. We only escape reductionism when we also examine the momentous consequences for her mind and self. In other words, this is about meaning making, which is surely the point of departure of the entire project of narrative medicine. Meaning making is always involved when we suffer from illness and life-changing accidents, from anxieties and existential preoccupations. To cope with such concerns, we tend to use language. More precisely, when in trouble, we need narrative, as Jerome Bruner once put the matter in very succinct terms. Now, connected to this, we seem to also need the idea of a self, perhaps even of the self, at least in what has been called the Western cultural domain. It is puzzling, actually, to see the self as being so central to the constitution of meaning in our lives. Not only because the self is a notoriously messy concept, it also is originally a philosophical construct, and what this means I will explain in a moment. If you take a look at the history of the idea of the self as a self-reflexive and substantiated unity, we recognize a time-honored battle horse, often interchangeable with terms like identity, subjectivity, and ego. It has managed to withstand centuries of debates and criticism. Take the field of psychology. Given the individualistic perspective of most psychological research and intervention, it is not surprising that we find the individual self at the heart of the entire discipline. After all, the self is the fundamental category, the immediate datum in psychology, to again use the words of William James, one of the discipline's founding fathers. If, however, one views the self from a from a more critical perspective, and that's actually what I want to do in my talk, then it appears as the straitjacket of much of traditional psychology and psychiatry, a contraception that imposes an individualistic gravitational pull on the ever-fluid nature of human existence. Now, I've already touched on the distinction between molecules and meanings. Clearly, the self is well anchored in the fabric of discourse, which makes up one part, the meaning-oriented part of the universe. It ranges across the entire spectrum of our being in the world, from the healthy self to the sick self, from the Western self to the self in crisis. The variations are endless. Most of the time, it is taken for granted that the self is a given entity, a manifest entity that acts on the same, let's say, molecular level as well as a virus. COVID-19 and the coronavirus discourse are impressive examples of the self going viral in a global arena. The language of the recent pandemic, and especially the idea of a virus attacking the modern self, the innocent self, the powerless self, demonstrate the scope of the idea of a substantialized self that is even present in the clinical context. Here we have a self which is almost congruent to what we usually call a person. And there's a virus, and the virus is the enemy and now attacks the self. So we have a simple idea and a dramatic formula repeated in all kinds of discursive a narrative context, from the New York Times to Le Monde, from political debates and countless social networks, well, to rounds and medical schools. My main critical point here is what connects most of these meanings attributed to the self, especially to the self in crisis, are highly problematic assumptions underlying the narrative and metaphorical scenarios that give shape to these thoughts. First, there's the ontological assumption, you might call it, the idea that there is a self, an independent, stable, and self-reflexive entity associated with an individual, a person. Second, there's the idea that this self has come under heavy attack, like a vital organism comes under attack when a coronavirus is inhaled and infects lung tissue, comparable to an intruding microbiotic terrorist, as an infectious disease expert called the coronavirus. The implication of these discourses, however, is that before all this happened, before the virus attacked the organism, like the cell was functional. In fact, both appear here as healthy and autonomous subjects. There's of course a long tradition of critical thinking in philosophy and the social sciences that has repudiated exactly this idea of the self as an autonomous entity, a bastion of the ego that defends its sovereignty against hostile intruders. Nevertheless, it seems that the idea is not only a veteran battle horse, it also is a comeback kit. It returns again and again, irrespective of all defeats it already suffered. Using, again, a more clinical and therapeutic language, we would say the self is immensely resilient. It is more a cultural figure than an analytical category. My example of the coronavirus attacking the Western self can also demonstrate how the idea of a substantial self reappears, especially in times of crisis, of catastrophe, of illness. It is used in the wake of events that can be depicted by tropes comprising an external attacker, and as it were, a self is now busy organizing its defense. The self in crisis is the self attacked, as if the attack on the self in the first place confirms the idea of the self. If an identity can be attacked, it ostensibly must exist. Now, it has often been observed that psychological, psychosomatic, and therapeutic concepts are particularly prone to being substantialized. James' writing, already mentioned a few times, offered only one, although momentous, example of how the self could be reified and turned into a self-contained immediate datum. Apart from the period of behaviorism in America, there has always been an influential psychology of the self, actually ever since James formulated his definition of psychology. The problem of this tradition, which is anything but exclusively a tradition in psychology, is, however, more general. Many concepts coagulate and solidify the phenomena they articulate. In principle, concepts are meant to bring order and structure to chaos. But what if it is the very nature of the phenomena at stake that they are in constant transformation? There's a danger that concepts domesticate rather than help envision the chaos and the mess, the vagueness, ambiguity, and contingency that are part of human life, not to mention human imagination. Therefore, artists have always tried to avoid this imposition. Many are afraid of the moment in which the chaos is used up, as playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht noted, because, as he added, it is the best of time. Given conducive conditions, the concept of the self, or the concepts of the self, are like avatars that mutate into human characters. To understand this mutation, cultural narratology might help. Take pre-modern myth, which are comparable topical figures. Originally oral forms and practices spread in song, dance, and whispers, many mythical figures transformed and took on a robust, lifelike gestalt, reappearing for centuries, for millennia in religion, philosophy, literature, art, everyday imagination. Much of this mythical substantialization happens in storied form. In the life of a culture, there is an abundance of narrative material. The vaguer it is, the more it serves as a raw material for such transformation. Take this one. The self leads a peaceful, idyllic life, but then a challenger emerges out of the blue, or more precisely, out of an anonymous shop in a remote Chinese marketplace. Now we have the two protagonists needed for many stories, Corona and the self in crisis. At this point, it is not at all surprising to read in one of these stories, the question that I mentioned before, the question, how can such a tiny virus become so powerful, giving such a massive narcissistic blow to the modern self? Now it is perhaps helpful, very short, to remember that the term narcissistic blow has a venerable history. In 1917, Sigmund Freud distinguished 3 injuries to characterize events that challenged the narcissism, or more generically, the self-worth of a person or a group of people. Freud argued that the general narcissism of the Western self experienced 3 fundamental injuries. These humiliations of human self-worth came in the wake of 3 scientific discoveries: that of Copernicus, according to which we are not in the center of the universe, after all; that of Darwin, who showed that we are not of godly origin, but evolved in the same way as apes and, in fact, as viruses. And finally, Freud referred to the psychoanalytic discovery of the unconscious, the fact that we are not masters in our own home. While Freud has often been criticized for individualizing and biologizing certain aspects of human psychology, his view of the historical dimension of the Western self and the various crises it experienced can be understood as an attempt to culturally localize these crises beyond the individual domain. Freud might have neglected many other socio-historical aspects, but I think it's remarkable that at a time where we are in the early 20th century, when the universalist claims of Western science, as well as psychiatry, psychology, and philosophy, were generally taken for granted, he conceived of the idea of the self as a highly cultural construct. Freud argued in the tradition of the Enlightenment imperative that the self has to be created by each individual anew, dare to know, have the courage to use your own understanding and act accordingly. Whatever you are, it is not evident. You have to find out. You have to create yourself. In this way, the concept of the self has turned more and more into an ever open question, a question in questions actually of interpretation. Put differently, the self fuses with the process of self-exploration, which in this context is just another word for self-interpretation. Freud, by the way, Freud argued against an ideal self and for the view of a world where things are, in short, where things are messy, and so is the self. In this world, there seem to be some fundamental questions that individuals, at least in the West, ask about themselves. The philosopher Charles Taylor has investigated these questions in his seminal book, Sources of the Self, the Making of the Modern Identity. These questions, Taylor points out, cannot be sufficiently answered with any general doctrine of human nature, whether religious, philosophical, or scientific, whether referring to soul, reason, or biology. Despite all these doctrines, we still have some fundamental questions about ourselves, about the meaning of ourselves in our lives. There is no concluding scientific explanation of the meaning of my being in the world. nor is there a philosophical system that offers a stringent theory of my existence. There always remains a persisting question about me, about myself. I have suggested that the concept self does not refer to an existing or imagined substantial entity. Rather, it circumscribes an area of questioning, as Taylor formulates it. There's another aspect of Taylor's understanding of the modern tradition of the self that is important here. At stake is the tradition of a self that experiences its crises as inherent to the existence of a modern human. In other words, the search for oneself takes place in order to come to terms with oneself, not in order to tackle any external trouble or ward off an enemy intruder who challenges the health and peace of mind of an otherwise firm and stable self. I have used the coronavirus discourse as an example. From its beginning, that is the disappearance of the pre-modern world and the rise of capitalism and bourgeois culture, the modern idea of the self emerged as the question of its very meaning. Taylor has shown that this question never found a final, universal, valid answer. Now to finish, to conclude, I want to tie up some aspect of the self and its resilience by touching on a film, Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. Kristen, would you please upload the one photo that I have brought with me? Despite its medieval setting, the film, The Seventh Seal, was conceived of as an advanced modernist project. Today, it is considered as a timeless classic. The Seventh Seal represents a spectacular breakthrough of one of the most radical directors in film history. It tells the story of a knight, Antonius Block, who returns from a crusade to his homeland, Sweden, that is devastated by the plague. Death is everywhere. Coming home, the knight is completely disillusioned, and his journey has turned into a search for meaning. From the beginning of the film, it is clear death is waiting for him. The knight, however, manages to wrest his life from death for the duration of a match of chess. He wants to use this time for one last meaningful deed, ending what he sees as a pointless and wasted life. But before he dies, he wants to know whether there is a meaning to his existence. Kristen, I think we can take it down now, please. Well, to make it short, Block does not find the ultimate meaning of his life. He does not find an answer because even death cannot give him an answer. But despite his bleak outlook and the horrors of the Black Death in the background of the plot, the knight, portrayed by the great Swedish actor Max von Sydow, who we saw on this photo, on this poster, the knight is determined until the end to explore his options. Is there at least the possibility of still another layer of meaning to his life? Is there a sense, a purpose that he has not yet discovered, irrespective of the many battles he fought and lost, and the many thoughts that passed his mind? Even vis-a-vis death, he keeps wandering, as if the one meaningful deed he still hopes to carry out is to keep the question open. As if he insisted that there is still a question about himself, however thorny the idea is that allows him to think about himself as a self. Like all humans, even this mythical knight dies. But then, the film suggests, there must have been at least one moment in Bloch's life, an island in the flux of time, where these questions could be asked and accepted as ultimate concerns. In this moment, they would become for Bloch the dominant form of life itself, of being or having a self. This island surfaces during the chess match with death. Do you ever stop questioning? Death asks. The knight shakes his head. I cannot. At the same time, Bergman's film investigates one of the great modern myths of the self that I also mentioned before. Bergman investigates specifically how one of the great modern myths of the self came into being, namely the myth of the substantial self, the sovereign, self-reflexive subject. The Western ego that suffers, as we saw, from the narcissistic blows, according to Freud. At least for the time span of one chess match, Knight Antonio Bloch appears to be on equal footing with death, the ultimate challenger who always wins. One can watch Bergman's film itself as a myth-like narrative, a story about death and the different ways humans cope with it. Or in this movie, how they cope with him and his principle, no one escapes me. But at the end of the day, Bloch rejects the myth, even though he does not have any idea of how to win the chess game of life and death. He breaks out of the romanticizing story of man fighting death, a story quite similar to that of the self fighting the virus, the patient fighting disease. Whereas every myth is an answer to a question, Bergman leaves the question of the meaning of Bloch's existence unanswered, as he leaves us with the impression that the knight's life and his sense of existence cannot be distinguished from the search for himself. Thus, the film brings us to the point where we understand the dilemma of Bloch and indeed of Bergman, that the human search for meaning is endless, but lifetime is not. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens, for these comments. And I have so many thoughts. I'd like to land first, and if this seems a little far field, please just let me know. But this question of the resilience of the self, of the idea of the self, of the substantialized self, and its constant recurrence, I wonder if you might in any way link that to the power, not just the power of its continuing, but the power that it grants us in a certain kind of way. You construct this idea of the other substantial self that's attacked from the outside, and that reinforces this idea of a substantialized self. Can we push it to just a bit further to the idea that we actually need an enemy, that's the operations of this idea of a substantialized self depends on an othering, a placing outside, that which I am not, against which I define myself. And, I think it's there in your talk, you refer several times to the Western idea of self, and then to the myth of the coronavirus, which comes out of the East as an attack on that self, right? And I'm thinking here of, among other things, Sarah Ahmed's work on the West orienting itself, right, against the Orient, what we labeled the Orient, literally finding our place in opposition. So the idea that the self is contingent, fluid, questioning is a threat to that idea of the self, the operations of the Western self, around which power is established. I don't know. I'm opening this up as a question for you, I guess.
Want me to maybe reply now, or shall we wait? What's the procedure?
Yes. Okay. Yes, please.
No, I mean, it's very rich. Thank you very much for these many suggestions and comments and interpretations. One point to start with that is certainly puzzling that the self exists in face of another self, or in face of an enemy, in face of there's a kind of duality to it. Once we look at what has been the meaning of this idea of the self in the Western tradition, then very often the self, or its predecessor, the soul, in the Christian traditions at least, you see it as opposed to something which challenges it, which endangers it with menaces, the evil, devil, this disease, death. So you have an entire repertoire of figures, great theater actors that way to be, if you look at all the different versions. And it seems that this is necessary to keep it together, so to speak. This is sort of just this very, very meta kind of speculation. Why, for example, would the self need this kind of other self or other danger? I mean, why would we need a self at all? This is the big question. You could say there has been so much other different ways to look at human identity and human being in the world around. There are, since antiquity in the Western tradition, at least, the ideas of a dialogue, of interactive, of a communicative, of a social, of an interdependent self, of a discursive self. This is something which has never, I would say, never really made it to the dominant view. If there is crisis, if there is someone from the Chinese marketplace or the bad enemy in the political, ideological, spiritual arena, then we stand firm behind ourselves. So on one level, I've tried in my talk just to give sort of a kind of discursive overview. These are all forms of self that I, over the last couple of years, reading all the stuff about the coronavirus, about the pandemic, found that a certain amazing quantity of self lingo. So the Western self, and how the narcissistic blow at the self, and how is this possible? We are science, investigation, biomedicine. We are so advanced in every respect, and why do we go back to this kind of mythical idea of there's a self? So it's more for me this presentation attempt to get the problem straight, formulate the problem in the first place. Why do we need this massive construct of a self So it's, I suggest a few options, a few interpretations, a few possible answers to that, a few, because I don't think there's only one. But of course, I don't want to give an answer to this question. I would see it more like Ingmar Bergman at the end. You know, this is this interpreting process, this business of trying to figure out what it is that defines human existence. That is maybe the point of the self. But this is only one option. The other options and other ways to see the self.
Yeah. Correct. Fantastic. So by the way, you can drop questions into the chat now, and I'll be pulling some of those in just a minute. You've brought us to Brock at the end as Bergman's wonderful example of someone for whom this process of questioning never ends, even in the face of death. Of his experience, of course, it's set in a time of plague, which is not by any means accidental in your presentation here. So you've just indicated this way in which the corona pandemic, this idea of the substantialized self raises its head again, yet again, in numerous ways. But it would seem, if we're using Bergman's film as an example, it's also a time when we might ask these questions in new ways. And so I guess I'm asking how you see that as an opportunity for us.
I mean, this is the impression that I've got. It is a strong argument for accepting the idea of a self that is open, that doesn't come to a conclusion, where we won't have the one word or one sentence answer, where like the night we have to try it out, and maybe we reach a kind of conclusion. Montaigne in his wonderful tower at one point might have found that now he brought it all together, but Bloch certainly did not. And the most heroes in the 20th century, think of literature, think of art, certainly are not closed and rounded and well-formed identities. There are people, identities with problems, with crises, with their open fragments. They're basically, I quoted Charles Taylor, people who try to find out who they are, what is it all about, but not as an external disease, but as that what defines their existence. And this would be an alternative way to look at this review of self-representations. It's basically these are mythical figures. They're avatars that in the process of being articulated also by films, by novels, by theater, Bergman directors like Bergman, they take it on a certain shape. I mean, there's the idea of death as a figure, as in this film, is usually a very delicate thing. Bergman leaves it open. Is this actually a real figure? Is it a myth? Is it a projection? Is this a vision? Is it just sort of a mythical narrative that becomes virtual here? Or is it something that we, the Western self, need for figure out who we are? We need, in the last moment of life, why do we need death as a figure? We could also wonder, maybe there was no death as a figure, as a representative of a principle. There was my life. My life is complicated enough. So I don't need to find meaning in my life, something outside of my life, in this case, death, Bergman's sense. But I can take my life lived and fulfilled or unfulfilled as it is, as that was what it is. There's nothing else to define now. This would be one way to read Bergman, and that's why I used it at the end to summarize a bit my collection of problems, I would call it.
Terrific. Thank you. We do have some questions in the chat. Peter Perryman writes, during the chess match, we hear the classic line, quote, "As long as I resist you, I live." Peter asks, in the clinical context, is a patient in a constant state of resistance in order to maintain an idea of their self? Is it sometimes better to accept rather than resist?
Mhm. Well, this is very elegantly formulated at the question, but of course it is an answer to this, one of the many answers to this problem. Resist death, of course, for Bergman, doesn't make sense. It's a game. At the end, you lose all the time. So why shouldn't we change the protagonist, and instead of resisting and fighting and opposing and rebellion, why consider the process of that life has an end in different terms, in different pictures, in a different way that doesn't have this kind of existentialist horror. There are other forms to understand dying and death, and there are also other forms to understand the self without the death. Don't forget what I mentioned before. For a few hundred, actually almost 1,500 years in the Western tradition, the self was the soul. At the end of the day, the soul, of course, needed God. It needed an entire universe of assumptions and metaphysical theological presuppositions. Do we really want to take them all over when we see ourselves in this tradition? And therefore, I agree, we don't have to see the resistance as the ultimate goal. Why would we, at the end of the day, want to resist against the fact that life is endless, and not endless, but has a very precise biological and spiritual beginning and end?
Excellent. You say near the end of your paper, and quoting Charles Taylor, yourself suggesting that the concept of self doesn't refer to an existing or imagined substantial entity, but a circumscribes an area of questioning. And of course, that questioning largely takes place in discourse, language, as you've made clear. Can you speak to then the idea of the self as this questioning at the limits of language? You begin with reference to your previous talk with the woman who had experienced neurotrauma. You've written about also dementias and the role of memory and narrative in your work. So I'm just, can you bring those two things together? What that means for questioning?
I mean, for a long time, the idea of human identity was connected to the assumption of a substantial self. As I already said, when you look at Ian Hacking wrote an entire book, From the Soul to the Self. When we see this transformation of soul to self, then we see also a certain tradition. And in order to be a human being, we needed something within us, very deep, very firm, the sort of the robust inner self. We have the entire, the tropes of inner and outer, and within me and without me. And within me, we need something robust, something stable. And for a long time, and even today, I would say, for many people in the West, this was autobiographical memory, my own history, my life history, in as far as I'm able to remember it. And this is a tradition that lives on till today, that you need your memories in first of all, in order to know who you are. Without memories, you don't have identity. You're basically nothing. And this is something where now, of course, there are many memory research, medical, clinical practitioner today who would see this differently. Of course, you have identity even without autobiographical memories. Identity is so much more than just your own history remembered. It is something that even beyond language has to do with activities, with gesture, with forms of interaction, communication, with the way you live and you be embodied in your world. This is not only language. Language is very important, but it's not the only thing. You can still, without language and without memories, have identity. So this goes this now a different field, a field of research on autobiographical memory and what happens in cases where due to neurotrauma or other external events, people lose their autobiographical memories. This is not to say they lose their identities. There's also my earlier work on this. I think we could demonstrate, Maria Medved and myself, that this is simply wrong. People have a very strong, very manifest sense of themselves and who they are, even without having an autobiographical story, even without being narrators of themselves. So we have to be very careful with all the emphasis we usually put on narrative, that we see also certain limits.
There it relates to a matter that several people have raised in their questions with respect to the relationality at the core of identity, the core of the self, that we stand, we are formed in relation to others. And if that ourselves live in that relation, it's quite a different idea than the idea that I am a substantialized self, and when my memory disappears, I'm gone.
I mean, this is sort of my answer to this question, where sort of metaphors such as the battle horse or the comeback kid, it's a big issue. Why I would say it's still the dominant view of the human individual in the West, that of someone grounded in a substantial self. And why is it still, for example, a big goal in the therapeutic industry that you have to get this self, to find yourself, to be yourself, to develop your own self, and so forth. Despite the fact that I agree with you and with the comments that obviously some people also made, we have very sophisticated views to see the relational, the interactional, the discursive dimension of human existence, and we see them much more clearly today than maybe 100 years ago, 200 years. I mean, the entire history of philosophy in the 20th century, from George Herbert Mead, from Durkheim, Halbwachs, up to Habermas, Derrida, Rorty, Judith Butler. I mean, these are all very smart people that all have a very sophisticated idea of what else we could use in categorical language to understand the self as a relational being. And in psychology, we have the entire tradition from Vygotsky to Brunner. But still, I would say this is, for complex reasons, it's certainly not the dominant idea. The dominant idea in the Western world, and this was a bit the start of my little presentation today. Why is it so? Why do we believe it's necessary to have a substantial self? Why, for example, in situations of crisis, of conflict, of disease, of pandemics, the virus, ourself. So then all of a sudden it's there again, as if nothing ever has happened. As no one of these people I just mentioned ever had written a line. Sort of, we start from scratch. Why?
Yeah. Well, terrific. We've run out of time, unfortunately, Dr. Brockmeier. I could continue talking for hours. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to make sure everybody knows that a recording of tonight's event will be shared later this week via an email to all who registered. And we hope to see you all next month on April 3rd, when we welcome author Lucy Sant, who will be in conversation about her most recent book, I Heard Her Call My Name. So again, Dr. Brockmeier, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Craig.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Goodbye, everyone. Great evening.
Bye-bye, Craig. Bye-bye, Rita.